On July 12, 2020, Denver area news agencies issued a health warning to the public, especially those who live in and around Morrison, Colorado. Now, if you're a fan of live music performances, you might recognize Morrison as the home of the internationally famous Red Rocks Park and Amphitheater. You might be thinking, Van, you're delusional. Health warnings are everywhere because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, that's true, but this warning was on top of the ones that we've been hearing since March 2020. Some national news outlets picked up the story behind the warning, so you may have heard that a squirrel captured in Morrison tested positive for the bubonic plague. That's right. To refresh your memory, the bubonic plague, along with the pneumonic plague, created a social atmosphere and time period that we call the Black Death. In just 4 short years, between 19 and 38 million people in Europe died. Consider this impact. In 1340, there were 170,000 inhabited villages and cities in the Germanic countries. But by the end of the 14th century, only 130,000 were left inhabited. In light of our current international health crisis, I thought it would be helpful to know that we have been here centuries ago and survived. Faith, trust, patience, and innovation are essential to get us through this crisis. Despite many Americans and Europeans' pathological view of life in their own countries, we're much better off than those who lived just a handful of centuries ago. To help us better understand our current health challenges, the Vantage Point is going to pay a visit to the 14th century to find out why Europe was susceptible to the spreading disease, where the plague originated and how it spread, and how society survived the deadliest pandemic that the world has ever witnessed. I hope you'll join me. There are times when it seems the stars are in perfect alignment for good things to happen. Unfortunately, celestial alignments can mean a time of foreboding dread and environmental calamities. Please note that I said seems. I'm not into astrology and reading the stars for insights about life on Earth. I do, however, think that astronomy is very important. In any event, between 950 and 1250 AD, the Earth, especially the North Atlantic, entered a warm climatic period that historians and geographers call the medieval optimum. It was the hottest epoch in the North Atlantic since the Roman warm period. The optimum conditions spurred on vegetative growth, which in turn helped jumpstart a minor explosion in human population. The absence of epidemic diseases was another reason for the population to explode during the medieval optimum. Unfortunately, that was not the case in southwestern China. That part of Asia had experienced a number of recurring battles with the plague. It was during the optimum that the Vikings spread out from the overpopulated lands of Scandinavia. By 1300, most of Europe's arable farmland was being cultivated. Even some of the less desirable lands were being tilled to meet the demand for food. This situation was made worse by the Little Ice Age. The cooler temperatures brought lengthy periods of rain that caused many crops in northern Europe to rot. In more southerly places, the growing season was shortened. The Little Ice Age introduced a famine that weakened the population. Many folks died from starvation and diseases brought on by poor nutrition. It was a real-life example of Thomas Malthus's theory and the Malthusian trap. Meanwhile, in Asia, the largest contiguous empire the world had ever witnessed was forming under the rule of the Mongols. You might find it interesting that the Mongols and some eastern woodland American Indians like the Cherokee share common ancestors. The Mongols' presence in Eastern Europe explains why Native American DNA is sometimes found among modern residents of Europe. Nonetheless, Mongol lands stretched from the Pacific coast in the far east to Eastern Europe and the Black Sea in the west. While the subject of Mongolian rule is worthy of a series of sessions in and of themselves, suffice it to say that the Mongols brought law and order to the trade routes that connected Europe and Asia. Mongol soldiers also ventured into southwestern China, where the plague was still wreaking havoc. Mongol soldiers then unwittingly introduced diseased rats into cargo shipments moving along the trade routes. Unfortunately, it was through those routes that death traveled. Genoese merchants operated ships that sailed from the Black Sea through the Bosporus Straits and into the Mediterranean. In October 1347, at least one ship sailed out of the Black Sea port of Kaffa. Among its cargo were stowaway rats playing host to fleas infected with a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The ship and its sick crew made their way to Sicily, a Mediterranean island located to the southwest of the toe of Italy. Sicily was the first European area to be infected by the bacterium. Because of its large number of port cities, mainland Italy was next to experience the unnamed and seemingly invisible killer. Italy's population was hit extremely hard, especially in larger cities like Florence, Genoa, and Venice. Those cities had populations of more than 100,000 each before the plague. Upwards of 50 to 60% of their inhabitants were killed between 1347 and 1351. In 1348, the plague had moved along the trade routes into southern England, western France, and the Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Scandinavia and Eastern Europe were infected by the end of 1351. As in Italy, the death tolls in England, France, and Germany approached 50%. The impact on the population in Eastern Europe was thankfully less severe. While a host of medical treatments failed to produce a measurable recovery rate in the 14th century, it was the practice of shunning the ill, which is a form of social distancing if you think about it, that helped stop the spread. Social distancing also occurred when some city folk took refuge in the country and away from people and rats carrying the infection. That option was generally limited to those who could afford a second estate or home, or who had relatives who would welcome them into their houses. The cold, damp conditions of the Little Ice Age made it difficult to simply live in the forests. No doubt some people did manage to escape the plague by hunkering down in primitive lean-tos and makeshift cabins that they hastily built in the forests. There are actually three kinds of plague that wreaked havoc during the Black Death: septicemic, bubonic, and pneumonic. The names are based on where the infection makes a home in its human host. Septicemic is in the bloodstream, bubonic is in the lymph nodes, and pneumonic plague is in the lungs. As I mentioned earlier, the bacterium Yersinia pestis causes all three varieties of the plague. While the bubonic plague is deadly, it's less lethal than the pneumonic and septicemic strains. According to Rocky Mountains PBS, the untreated death rate from the bubonic plague is 50%. With antibiotics, the bubonic plague death rate ranges from 1 to 15%. Pneumonic plague death rate is about 100% if untreated, and with antibiotics, and if the treatment begins early in the day in which the symptoms appear, the death rate is about 40% for pneumonic plague. The mortality rates are similar for the septicemic strain. It's hard to believe this, but many Americans and residents in the United Kingdom take so much for granted. We have many more technological innovations and medical treatments at our disposal than our ancestors living in the 14th and 15th centuries enjoyed. The discovery of bacteria didn't even occur until 1676 when a Dutch innovator named Antony van Leeuwenhoek first laid human eyes on them through the single lens microscope that he had personally designed and manufactured. An infected squirrel, like the little guy caught in Morrison, is most likely not the only rodent in the area that's carrying the bubonic plague. Yersinia pestis can move into the lungs and become airborne. Once that happens, it spreads quickly in social environments. When an infected person coughs, tiny bits of mucus and saliva infused with bacteria can be breathed into the lungs of non-infected people. It's important to note that COVID-19 can spread this way too. So, if you become ill with the coronavirus and wear a mask in public, you will reduce the chance of infecting others. If you have pneumonic plague and are not on antibiotics, Move to an isolated location and let authorities know of your illness and whereabouts. If there's anything that can be done for you, knowledgeable responders will come to your aid. Making peace with God is not a bad idea either. I hope you got something out of today's show. Take care of you and yours, and I look forward to seeing you here again on The Vantage Point.